trad movement is intertwined with the MAHA movement and the individualism of classical liberalism, which is corrosive to the soul as they see it. So I think a lot of people have actually gone back genuinely to that. The pagans, as we were talking about earlier, have gone back to the Bronze Age, literally. And you know, some people maybe they prefer the Iron Age. And when you start to question that, you're questioning modernity, all of it.
Liberty and market competition is inevitably going to lead us to this deterritorialization of traditional values. We'd call that a distinction between the base and superstructure.
Yes.
So is the new right agreeing with the Marxist analysis? God.
Yes. Yes.
Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Emily Jashinsky, a political commentator and a co-host of Breaking Points. This is one of the things I appreciate about your perspective, because a real challenge on the left in the last few years is to get people out of this mindset of like Reagan, Christian conservatism, patriarchal society, like that being the hegemonic structure. And there are degrees to which that is still intact, but we also have an era in many spaces in society of progressive cultural hegemony. And when you're trying to talk about the shift of young people's political sentiments, you can't really explain one without the other. And that has been a very difficult thing for people on the left to grasp, that they are actually meaningfully in charge of certain levers of culture, particularly movies, Hollywood, Netflix, this kind of stuff. Why has that been so difficult to grasp for people on the left?
Yeah, that's super interesting, because right now I think we are starting to see that change too, the progressive hegemony in different institutions. And trying to explain a lot of this to people on the right was interesting, because you constantly hear people, you know, in the conservative movement, which I've come out of, basically say, communist Hollywood, communist, right? And the left hears that and they apply a Chomsky lens to it. And they're like, what are you talking about? These are arch capitalists who are laundering wokeness through their films to make more money or whatever. I mean, there's a like timeless story about, I think it was the Urban Outfitters CEO who was selling back in like 2008 Pride t-shirts while donating in the Prop 8 race. Like just
really?
Yeah, you know, like that's
brilliant.
A tale as old as time, of course. But there was that I hate the label cultural Marxism. I think it's probably the best shorthand we have. There was this adaptation of a cultural Marxism in those corridors, because millennials who were less interested in seizing the means of production were seizing the means of cultural production without seizing the means of economic production. And there's overlap, of course, but they weren't intentionally trying to overthrow the capitalist system. They were trying to overthrow the white supremacist, whatever, misogynistic system. And that is where I think the left underappreciated its own power over those institutions. And a lot of it was because the quote-unquote left who took over the institutions were from affluent bubbles. And were not, you know, they had no idea how to seize the economic means of production if they wanted to. And they didn't even want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the difficulty of our current moment. And some of these things may be shifting now, but so much focus on this war of semiotics and symbols and narratives in this cultural layer, while the rest of society, the base, to use the Marxist term, is becoming more and more scarce. People are being disappropriated and proletarianized. Do you think this drift rightward is going to continue among young people?
I think it might continue among young men. But it's also sort of scrambling what we think of as right and left, because during the Trump years, originally during the Trump years, you know, the right was owning the question of free speech, for example. And now it's basically impossible for the right to own the issue of free speech after what happened with, for example, Rumeysa Ozturk. It looks insane to support jackbooted thugs pulling kids off the street for writing op-eds that were critical of Israel. I mean, it's just the craziest stretch to now say that the right owns the issue of free speech, just as it was a stretch to say that the left owned the issue of free speech in 2018 or whenever it was. So I don't know that it's necessarily going to go back to 2018 or peak woke, whatever we want to call it, but I do sense that, I know,
it's
capital P, capital W.
It was actually peak woke. I think there's some like quantitative data that supports that. Like,
yeah, The Economist had a really interesting, had some great research on this. But yeah, I mean, my sense of Gen Z is that right now they can be won by Pod Save America and
Really?
others. Yeah, because it's just as cynical as it was from some people on the right. But if you're able to create that illusion of authenticity, and you're able to say point at Donald Trump, who has really never been popular with young people until the podcasters circled around him and were curious. Well, the podcasters aren't super curious about Trump anymore. They're not going to be curious about J.D. Vance. My colleague Sagar and Jetty asked if J.D. Vance passes the vibe test to Andrew Schultz. The answer was no. And I think we kind of all know that. Marco Rubio isn't going to be wowing Theo Von.
No.
And, probably no Dem is either. Yeah. But that's just gets us back to where things were.
Yeah, is Gavin Newsom going to? He's got his own podcast now.
No, I mean, Gavin Newsom, I think, is someone who's smart enough to know there's 2 steps. He has step 1 down. He's smart enough to know where the winds are blowing, but he's not smart enough to execute.
The winds that are blowing the fire all over his state.
Yeah. That was actually a really apt metaphor. But he's smart enough to sense, and this doesn't take, you don't have to be super clever to sense that people are flocking towards podcasts, but for the low bar of being in the Democratic Party establishment circle, he is smart enough to sense that podcasts actually are important and it's not a passing fad. And the way that you are good on podcasts is trying to be honest, talking to Charlie Kirk about how your son loves him, or whatever else. He passes the first step, but he's not smart or moral enough to then get to the next point of the process.
You've done some recent reporting about right-wing sentiments towards Israel, particularly among Gen Z as compared to millennials and Gen X. How has that shifted over the past few years?
Yeah, and this gets back to the question about whether Gen Z stays trending conservative. I don't know that it's classified as conservative to be anti-Israel in the way that Gen Z is becoming anti-Israel, which is saying that this is basically you have the strong power oppressing the weak power. And I mean, I think you can make all kinds of classically liberal arguments against that in a way that's lowercase c conservative. But it's not, the raw Cold War power argument at all. I mean, you see some people making an America First argument against Israel, but a lot of it is just, this is wrong. What's happening is morally wrong, not because it's bleeding American resources, but because people are dying in mass and starving. And I don't know that you can classify that as conservative or liberal so much as you can classify that as classically liberal or
kind of universal liberalism.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So interestingly, I was going through this hypothetical in my head thinking about, would Marjorie Taylor Greene in 2014 have applied the label genocide to what happened in Gaza? And I don't think so, because at the time, she would have been shut out of the entire right-wing ecosystem with no opportunity to climb back in.
Yeah,
nobody would have tossed her a ladder because she would have been blacklisted at Fox News immediately. There's no question about it.
So what was it that changed?
The incentive structure. So now she can go on War Room with Steve Bannon.
Politics or media?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think there was no incentive for her to say what she really thought about that. I don't even know if she would have thought that back in 2014, but there was no incentive structure for her to do that because her career basically would have been over. Now, though, the gatekeepers have a lot less power, which means that in their place, you have the blossoming of things like War Room or, it sounds funny to say this, but Newsmax, whatever, Real America's Voice, I think War Room's on that. But she also has a super powerful Twitter feed that's not just the hackneyed 40,000 follower press accounts that politicians used to have outside of maybe Obama in 2010 or whatever. So now she can create her own content farm if she really needed to on YouTube, Instagram, X. And so with her, I think that's a good example of the medium really being the message. The message has changed because the medium has changed. And that means we're about to see, I think, a lot more left-right populism in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that, actually. I think there's a kind of clear analysis now that podcasters are becoming political, but similarly, there's a convergence where politicians are becoming influencers, and all of those things are downstream of the media environment shifting. what is the influence of James Burnham on today's new right? He wrote this very influential book called The Managerial Revolution. He was a Trotskyite. He breaks with Marxism, and it's like, yes, the capitalist class will be overthrown, but it will be overthrown by this class of managers. It's kind of a new right analog to the professional managerial class.
I think Burnham was really influential in 2017, 18, 19, 20, because of actually what we were talking a little bit about before, which is these institutions are suddenly, the hegemonic leftist control of them is suddenly kind of crumbling, and in a very quick way. And I think that's going to force people, Patrick Deneen in Regime Change wrote about this already. He wrote about needing a new elite, and that is an intoxicating idea for a lot of young right intellectuals, because what does that mean? It means you are the new elite.
Exactly.
And you are going to seize the means of cultural production. Yeah, exactly. And it means that you can create new groups where you spend donor money on fancy champagne and wear tuxedos. And that's a thing that happens. So I think Burnham is actually, if anything, like losing steam on the new right.
Oh, interesting.
But you did really, the professional managerial class analysis became, that caught traction really quickly in a way that I think grew into the antitrust movement on the right, and grew into the sort of reactionary cultural right, because it sort of was, Burnham, I think, gave people the diagnosis.
Yeah.
That hadn't happened before. People hadn't really been thinking about it in that context. And that really, I think, had people questioning the limits of capitalism in conjunction with what they wanted to see in the culture. Politics in college were, I was in college from 2011 to 2015.
Yeah.
And that's when...
Oh, wow. What a time to graduate.
Yes, right? I graduated in May of 2015. Trump started running for president like a couple weeks later. But it was, when we saw a lot of what came to be called wokeness started to bubble up. And so much of it was cultural.
Yeah.
The right at the time was obsessed with the small government and the Tea Party movement. But I think I came into that understanding the Tea Party as cultural populism, not as economic populism. And because I was from Wisconsin and, outside of D.C.
There's that famous sign, that "Get your government hands off my Medicare." Right?
Yeah. That time was just, I guess it was a good time for me to be in college and thinking about politics, because I was much more interested in culture than I was in politics. And it was clear to me that politics was becoming so much more a question of culture. And in college, I worked for Christina Hoff Sommers for 2 years at the American Enterprise Institute. And as I was leaving, Christina was starting to get involved in Gamergate. And we had started to see, the I know, it's incredible. And we had started to see the seeds of what, grew into like this woke flower being planted. And just totally foundational for me, or formative for me.
We recently did a study group of like going back to the source material of Gamergate. It is the Archduke Ferdinand assassination of the culture war. Like, so much started then. So many influencers became prominent in that space. I want to ask you, though, about your political formation, your evolution. Were you always skeptical of libertarian ideas? Because this was, it sounds almost silly to say now, but this was orthodoxy on any kind of right-wing institution or think tank. And now people are questioning these things in a very new way in the last few years.
No, I was not always skeptical at all. I think I probably identified myself as libertarian in college, like most people who are in the conservative movement had their...
Well, when did you start to question it?
Pretty quickly. Within a couple of years of coming to DC, I started to question it. But, that lasted, I think it lasted until probably 2016. And in fairness to me, I was young and, not particularly interested in economics. But the fusionist dogma...
Can we, for people who don't know what fusionism is?
Absolutely. Fusionism is super interesting. It came out of the 50s and the 60s, but the idea was, some people may say it goes back even further than that, but the idea was that the Republican Party, the conservative movement, could be held together by 3 pillars, and it needed to be held up by 3 legs of the stool, is how they always described it, which was neoconservatism, so strong national defense, sometimes how it gets described, traditional values, social conservatism, and then libertarian economics,
Right.
small government economics. And that was, if you go back to the 1960s, really codified in what was called the Sharon Statement, the founding document of Young Americans for Freedom. The reason, explicitly in the Sharon Statement, that conservatives long believed those three legs of the stool went together is because it was fundamentally the moral defense against communism, that communism was the single greatest threat facing humanity. And with those three legs of the stools, it just is cohesive. What's interesting about what started to happen around 2016 is that got questioned in a way that I don't even think Pat Buchanan had done.
Really?
Because I think at that point it was so abundantly clear, like Pat Buchanan's candidacy did not catch on. When Trump's candidacy catches on, way more than Pat Buchanan or Ross Perot, even though he's borrowing some of the same ideas, I think the economic rot in the deindustrialized parts of the country had been sort of fulfilled. And that's also during the fentanyl epidemic. The ravages of deindustrialization, sadly, had started to become too hard to ignore. And that's when people started saying, your constant deference to these companies who have sold out to China has created the fentanyl problem, has created the marriage problem, has created this problem with people questioning literally everything down to the biological reality of sex. And that sounds crazy, but if you look at these different parts of the country, people are completely untethered. And social media, I think, heightened that for a lot of people looking around and saying, why were we so deferential to Mark Zuckerberg and these guys who are now pushing insane algorithms on all of us? That was pretty powerful. And that's when a lot of it was Iraq and Afghanistan too, communities that have been particularly affected by deployments, and that immediately said, well, I'm not voting for a party to get low taxes that sends, my nephew to Iraq.
Biggest data point as a predictor of who voted for Trump if they knew someone who died in the wars of Iraq or Afghanistan.
And people forget that, and I think Trump sometimes forgets that.
On this topic of fusionism, so just to reiterate, three legs of the tripod: traditional values, libertarian economics, and neocon military might, let's say. So my understanding, this show coming from the social democratic left, we spend a lot of time talking about the right. And I think it's because, well, the right is obviously in power right now, but also a lot of these values, analysis, prescriptions of what to do about the economic problems in the U.S. have started to crop up on the right because the left has been unable to address them. So the core conflict in those kind of three legs of the tripod, as I understand it, is that the libertarian economics is in some ways at odds with the traditional values. So the example that I would give for this always is that Uber comes into your town. All of a sudden, there's this option to pick up a side gig. And as people are competing for wages, you have this possibility of selling your free time to earn side income, and where you would want to take Sunday off and attend church and go to the bowling alley in the Robert Putnam sense, now you have to work and become a gig worker, a freelancer. And so it becomes increasingly hard to maintain those kind of unpriced traditional values and rituals of society while you're in an environment of increasing market competition. Is that more or less what people on the new right have come to, that the libertarian economics are kind of eating away at the traditional values leg of the tripod?
Yes, and you hear this in Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance, because a lot of the young conservatives around them who write their speeches and do their research were reading Sohrab Ahmari against David French back in 2017.
Right.
And Rubio talks about, and I think Vance uses this line as well, how markets don't exist for the sake of markets. They exist for the sake of families, and then for communities, and then for the country. Markets are not just nature. Markets are political constructs that we have a duty to manage, because again, they do not just exist in nature. They are not just with us like oxygen is with us. We are the creators of markets. Thus, we are obligated to manage markets in a way that benefits the family, in a way that benefits the community, in a way that benefits the country. Now, where I think people like Patrick Deneen have landed, which is interesting. And it's where, I mean, I sometimes myself go back and forth on this, but I'm pretty firmly in like the Rubio Vance camp. He would argue and look at something like OnlyFans, or people in his world would look at something like OnlyFans and say, what classical liberalism, including neoliberal economics, can never do is stem the tide that leads us from, where we were in 1900 to OnlyFans in 2025. That the human condition is such that classical liberalism, without proper ends, without proper agreement on the ends, we will never be able to maintain our agreement on the ends, right? You can't have a sense of what the good is in a classical liberal system, because the human condition is such that capitalism is always going to drag us into people no longer worrying about the stigma of being an OnlyFans billionaire. The man who, right, where in 1960, the idea that you would be the OnlyFans billionaire who has wrecked so many young women's lives and all of that, you wouldn't be able to exist in the United States. I mean, I don't think the OnlyFans guys do. I think they're from somewhere else. But you wouldn't be able to exist in polite society.
So the idea is that liberty and market competition is inevitably going to lead us to this deterritorialization of traditional values.
Yes.
And previously, the assumption was that so long as those traditional values are intact, we don't actually need market regulation because those things are more firm.
Right. It's John Adams.
So this is where it gets really interesting, because I come from a certain intellectual background. We'd call that a distinction between the base and superstructure.
Yes.
So is the new right agreeing with the Marxist analysis? God.
Yes. Yes.
And everyone on the left is a fucking ad busters neoliberal, and the new right has rediscovered base and superstructure. Incredible.
Alienation.
Yeah.
I mean, alienation of the labor, alienation as a condition in and of itself. And I mean, I actually think sometimes you see this a little bit in Chris Rufo. They're almost like, we're almost getting into a territory where we're talking about heightening the contradictions and going through a series, different chapters, basically. You could almost call it Marxist.
On this topic of the kind of flip in analysis between left and right, what do you see as the biggest weakness of the Democratic Party right now?
Yeah, I think the Democratic Party right now is, the fundamental weakness. I think in the context we were just talking about.
It's a lot to pick from.
So I just think they underestimate the importance of the social condition of people, and that's why they were so easily swayed by, again, I keep using wokeness as a shorthand, even though I hate it and it is very cringy, but whatever that was.
Yeah.
I think they were so easily swayed by that. And I think they forgot that the average American wants to live a middle-class life with a nuclear family and is not obsessed with work, wants to retire at a reasonable age, and just wants to live in a nice place with a nuclear family. And I think that was a real problem for Democrats during the Trump era, because they actually had some interesting, like the Biden economic policy. As a conservative, I looked at it and I'm like, that was way too much spending in a really short period of time without a lot of cohesive. You can maybe make a conservative argument for it if it had some type of undergirding that wasn't just, we're going to spend a bunch of money and everything will be fine. But he actually did have a fairly robust economic policy that even some people like Matt Stoller look at and say, well, that wasn't so bad. But they messaged it in a way that was disastrous. And
it's terrible, yeah.
And they conceived of the policy in a way that wasn't, I think, when you're doing the way that they talked about green energy and saw it, the policy itself was neoliberalism. And it wasn't, this is for the sake of rebuilding strong families, strong communities, which is what the average American wants the economy to do. They don't want the economy to make the stock market go up even higher. They want to see it on the ground in their lives. And what they want their lives to look like, on average, is a healthy, strong nuclear family and a healthy, strong community. And that, I think, the sort of liberal elite has lost sight of for a lot of different reasons, partially because they tend to live in those communities and live those lives and forget that it's a priority in places where that's less attainable.
This kind of disconnect among liberal elites is a very significant political influence right now, I would say. We've been talking a bit about the influence of media in various instances. Why haven't those liberal elites been able to produce a successful podcast of their own?
This is probably the more superficial fundamental flaw of the Democrats. It's not superficial at all, but I guess I mean it in a political sense. Like their real weakness just in the PR battle is that they're incapable of being authentic. And that's what the Republican Party was until Donald Trump forced the Republican Party to dispense with some norms of political communication. And I think a lot of Mitt Romney in 2012, going to the Iowa State Fair with rolled up Brooks Brothers sleeves and pretending to enjoy a corn dog. Mitt Romney is a private equity baron. Right. And in a sense, I think Mitt Romney would have had more political success if he had been more like Trump when it came to how he presented himself, which was he ran from the Obama administration's, private equity attacks. And those were, I think, substantively really good attacks on Mitt Romney as someone on the right. I mean, talk about Fusionism failing. Yeah, private equity is the ground zero of Fusionism's failure. And Romney, if he had actually leaned into private equity and said, hey, listen, some of these bad companies they were going to be torched anyway. And like what I did was awesome and came in and I'm just really smart. And I'm just, I'm smarter than a lot of other people. Like he could have handled it in a way where Trump goes to the Iowa State Fair and gives kids helicopter rides. It's like incredible. Like you couldn't script it. And so I think Republicans have a little bit of an advantage on Democrats public relations wise right now because Trump forced them to. You don't get a J.D. Vance who can sit through 3 hours of a Joe Rogan experience and come across looking pretty good. That wasn't a disaster for him. Whereas if Kamala Harris or Tim Walz had did 3 hours on Joe Rogan, it would not have gone well. I mean, they just would have seemed like robots. They would have seemed like people who were acting authentic as opposed to people who were just being authentic. And the Republican Party, that's their advantage they have on Dems right now because Dems rejected that. And their argument against Trump in the Biden era was that we are going to be the party of civility and decency, and we are going to bring back the America you knew before. And that meant speaking very scripted in the familiar political style that would have been not out of place in 1998. But that doesn't give you an advantage anymore. And so I think that's one of their biggest problems is they don't have a bench of people who are believably authentic when they're speaking. Like Gavin Newsom's a really good example. That's where Zohran Mamdani was able to come in and be successful is he comes across as genuine when he's talking. And it's not the same as being Gavin Newsom, right? It's just so very different.
To watch part 2 of this episode, you can support the show on Patreon. Have you heard this? I guess it's a theory. No one's done the accounting, but that the existence of Doge may have cost more money than they actually saved by cutting all these jobs and programs?
Absolutely. And again, like as somebody who believes that the administrative state's growth has hampered us in many different ways, there was a complete inefficiency to the way Elon Musk came in and expected that the cult of Elon Musk would be the most efficient solution to gutting administrative capacity, because now we are looking at, we have the airport in our background here, an FAA that is struggling enormously and probably will end up getting more money like after all of this.
Right.
Because they may have needed more money. And, there were cuts that
they told me it was
made.
DEI.
Yes. And you know what? Unpopular. I do think there was some genuine DEI bloat at the FAA, or not even bloat, but that they actually had a hard time hiring people that were qualified for the positions because of DEI. I think there's actually pretty good evidence of that.
So DEI is crashing the plane.
DEI is crashing planes. I did like a radar on like it was much mocked on Rising back in the day that said cancel culture is killing people. That was the headline.
Wow.
And I stand by it.
Yeah.
You know, because I do think that it was actually true, like substantively true. And what I meant by that was really the way that arch capitalists were laundering DEI and cancel culture and whatever else. But I do think there's good argument at the FAA. But that's what Elon Musk said. It was like this knee-jerk, superficial social media ideology. I can come in and gut DEI and everyone will be better for it categorically because DEI is gone. And that is just like not how this works. Just again, directionally accurate in some sense that like there's bloat and that DEI was, I think it was also like flatly illegal, unconstitutional in a lot of cases.
In some cases it was, yeah.
Yep, totally. Like giving vaccines on the basis of race is an insane, unconstitutional thing to do.
It's extremely illiberal, and it's crazy that got past so many people, even in the center, but definitely on the left. Yeah. Can I ask you this question though? On you mentioned arch capitalists before in reference to like Hollywood and DEI and these things. Have you heard this? It's a theory analysis like Hollywood is post-capitalist. And so what people are doing through making movies like Lady Ghostbusters that lose money is they're actually purchasing valuable reputation among the capitalist class. Maybe a little bit of a course correction now because they've stopped making those movies, but for a while it was more prestigious, or you would gain more reputational value than you would expend capital in making those kind of like woke whatever, Hollywood blockbusters.
Yeah, I think that's the tug of war that was happening in Hollywood from the post-capitalists and the capitalists. The post-capitalists were and they thought they were post-capitalists. I don't think they actually were post-capitalists, but if you
they
imagine...
learned it's really expensive to be post-capitalist.
Yeah, right, exactly. Imagine you're the sort of hypothetical 2015 millennial Jezebel reader who is a writer in Hollywood, and again, it's 2015. What you want to do is promote and advance justice with your position in your life. You see that as what gives your life meaning and purpose. And so you believe that Hollywood should be used to dismantle the system of patriarchy and misogyny and white supremacy that, and I'm trying to be like actually charitable here, that the country was built on. And you believe that that is also fundamentally anti-capitalist, but you use the means of capitalism. You try to exploit the power of capitalism that you are participating in.
You're being more charitable than I would right now. That's
I mean, but I think that's how a lot of people did see it, that they were dismantling capitalism by using it to take down cultural ills. And with that, then the entire capitalist system falls, which is not correct. And I think that's become abundantly clear.
Right.
But it's much easier if you are an affluent, upwardly mobile millennial to believe that the cultural dominoes have to fall before the economic ones because you don't want to live in squalor.
Right. Well, I mean, what I would say is that I think that the people in that position, hypothetically, this Jezebel reader who's like an elite aspirant in some media field, that's a convenient narrative for her to think about her own career. But what's really happening is an intra-generational conflict in elite academies and institutions where if you can use those means to oust the person who's in a dominant position over you, you can ascend the career ladder. So it was very convenient, particularly in the art world, to get a curator canceled for some kind of transgression, and then the assistant curator gets promoted.
Right.
The kind of countervailing effect on that, which we find ourselves in now, is that people who are like not good coworkers don't tend to last long in institutions. And so a lot of the people who temporarily rose in those ranks are now nowhere to be seen. And the institution is in many cases worse off for it. There's a really respected curator at, people are going to immediately know who I'm talking about, who got fired for something that was just absolutely untrue. It was just factually incorrect. But the accusation was so powerful on social media. And this was someone who had been in a very reputable institution for decades and decades. Many, many cases like this throughout all media, not just the art world.
I think of the case of Bob Iger, or actually even Jamie Dimon.
Remind me, Bob Iger?
Head of Disney.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah, the rumored presidential candidate at one point. But Bob Iger goes from being dead set on using Disney to promote social values, right? Like same thing with Jamie Dimon, like, oh yes, ESG, this stuff is really important, all of that. And then suddenly now they don't speak like that at all. And
right,
for a while, what Bob Iger thought is that he could work in concert with his kind of angry, social justice oriented millennial employees who really wanted to, or Bud Light, the video that I think this was Rufo scooped at the time of the Bud Light, like, I don't know which was the marketing head at Bud Light talking about how they needed to appeal to like younger, more social justice oriented customers. And after the Dylan Mulvaney stuff broke, that video went super viral. There were videos like that from Disney at the time too. And you can see how Bob Iger says there's harmony between my goals, which is, you know, to be, I want to be just, and I want to be decent and kind, and that's what I'm being told to do. And so I think it's actually going to make us more money.
Yeah, you're expanding your market for, yeah, sure.
Absolutely. Like this is what the marketplace is demanding. The marketplace, and that's why they did actually invest in ESG. I mean, it wasn't a joke. Like they're actually putting money into it. And then the research started to show, I mean, it didn't pan out well for them, and that's why they stopped putting their money into ESG. It wasn't just the threats from the new administration. So anyway, like that, I think they thought they could harmonize these two goals for a while, and the tug of war now is the millennial Oberlin graduates lost, and Bob Iger won, in that he doesn't even have to nod to their goals and values anymore. He can just, I mean, he does still kind of nod to them, but anyway, like there was the sense that there was the middle of the Venn diagram was sustainable, and it wasn't.
Yeah. We've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about currents within social media that are fringe or activist, extreme, whatever, left and right all over the place. And then those things manifesting into real world political realities and institutions. What do you make of this MAHA seed oils debacle that's unfolding all around us? What do you think about what RFK is doing right now?
It's fascinating to me. This was ultimately adopted by a Republican administration rather than, I mean, Obama thought about RFK as his EPA head, and RFK was seen as too radical and too dangerous by the Obama administration.
Wow.
And, you know, there's no, J.D. Vance wouldn't put RFK in that position. I think we all know that it was only Donald Trump who could pull that off. And
it was like a deal for the endorsement, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And even that is incredible, because there were people on the right who were upset about putting someone in charge of Health and Human Services who was pro-abortion, or at least I should say he says that he's like anti-abortion but pro-choice. He's one of those types of Catholics. And
I grew up Catholic. I know a ton of people like that. It sounds very fringe, but it's actually, yeah.
Oh, I think that's super normal. I think that's actually where a lot of Americans find themselves.
Yeah.
But what we finally, I think, are doing is reckoning with the extremely rapid rate of change that happened over the last 100 years. I think 100 years is actually a good way to say it. And that includes agricultural production. I think that includes nuclear technology. All of these things, suddenly it became okay to question. I mean, it really is dominoes. Like as soon as you start questioning whether, as a conservative, whether capitalism is always in harmony with your take on cultural values, then you start questioning everything.
Right.
And a lot of people on the right did that. I think a lot of people on the left did that after the DNC did what it did to Bernie Sanders. It felt really disempowering in a way that made people look around and say, so do I have a voice in this political system at scale? Whereas, you know, that was the people who were watching Amy Goodman for decades, but now it's like it happened at scale.
Yeah.
And that's what the sort of left-wing media ecosystem was slow to catch up with, and is starting to catch up with now. But that's where I think RFK comes from, is this awakening that happened first on the right because of Trump, where everyone started questioning the foundation of the last 100 years and realizing that it was modernity, realizing that it was really shaky. And that's where you get some knee-jerk reactionary
Yep.
papists who believe it was the printing press.
Yeah.
And that's also where you get like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, who wrote what I think is a really good book called A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, that I think was foundational for a lot of people in MAHA world. And the other gateway drug for this was sex and gender. The idea that there was this almost new Gnostic approach to sex and gender was a wake-up call for a lot of people to see that being pushed by institutions. Because I think for a lot of people, they actually went along with it at first. And we're like, of course, it was post-Obergefell. Like, of course, people should be who they are. This is the United States of America. And when it started popping up in the school system, and when it started coming from corporations, I think people started to realize we had changed really, really quickly. And that, to me, I think was, for a lot of people, I think that was it wasn't for me, but for a lot of people, I think it was their gateway drug to questioning how quickly things had changed. And when you ask why things were changing so quickly, I think it was very clear that the social media revolution, smartphones, all of that had catapulted us from really quick but seemingly stable growth to something that felt wildly unstable.
Yeah. Okay. So there's like a institutional legitimacy question that's like pulling on the thread of a sweater.
Right.
And, that can start in one place, but it ultimately leads you to like, well, is the FDA correct about seed oils? Is
Totally.
Capitalism, industrial society even correct? I actually relate to this quite a bit because previous to this podcast, I interviewed a number of young Gen Z people, meme posters, political ideologues in their teenage years, 12 to 17, 18 to 24 in these two different projects. And a lot of them got into Ted Kaczynski, anarcho-primitivism, all of this kind of stuff of like beginning with this question of institutional legitimacy in some place and then tracing it all the way back, not just to like capitalism, industrialization in general, but like to the dawn of agriculture. And so they get like kind of, as you mentioned before, the utopia that they arrived at was something they called neo-band society, which was a nomadic group of hunter-gatherers that would live on the, general abundance of the land. And they would kind of maybe grow root vegetables, have migratory patterns and whatever. This is, the political imaginings of a 16-year-old, but those themes are actually like really pronounced hyperbolic versions of what a lot of adults are going through today.
Totally. The trad movement is intertwined with the MAHA movement.
Trad is,
and it's why, it's why I think it's fair to connect it all to like whether you're talking about nukes or agricultural capacity. I think it's people saying these studies of red dye number 40, that said it was perfectly safe or whatever it was, they have held up for decades. But we were the guinea pigs, and the experiment is starting to finish, and cancer rates are spiking. And nobody has a good answer to this. So maybe it's things that weren't studied or couldn't be studied, like the interaction of all of these different chemicals at scale in our food for so many years that you can't possibly test for. And when you start to question that, you're questioning modernity, all of it. And I do think that's what happened. That's why I think Christian circles and MAHA circles very quickly overlapped. And it's not something I would have predicted, but it does make sense when you think back on it.
So I have a certain direction I want to take this conversation, but let's just take the scenic route for a moment here. What do you do when you start to question modernity? Because I've spent a lot of time in this space. I'm very familiar with all of the internet characters you're talking about. And there are kind of competing versions of like the natural state of human society or mankind or whatever. Trad in and of itself has this kind of runaway problem where it's like, first they posit the 1950s, then it's the 1850s, then it's like, actually it's not capitalism at all, it's feudalism. And it's like, well, where do you stop? It's like, do you go back to hunter-gatherers, as a lot of young people do? What do you do with these questions about modernity?
My friend Michael Knowles, I think, has a quote where he said, I'm not talking about the 1950s. I'm not talking about the 1450s. I think he said, I'm talking about like the 1150s.
Oh, it's specifically the 11. Okay.
And Knowles is a Catholic. So yeah, it's a little bit different from
Is that like
him.
a Vatican II reference, or like what's the significance of 1150?
Just pre-Reformation, probably. I think he was just like off the cuff. But it goes back to like, again, your pre-printing press, your pre-Reformation. And I think a lot of the Catholic right does genuinely see that as when everything turned. And when we became atomized and we were on this track towards the individualism of classical liberalism,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is corrosive to the soul as they see it. So I think a lot of people have actually gone back genuinely to that. The pagans, as we were talking about earlier, have gone back to the Bronze Age, literally. And, you know, some people maybe they prefer the Iron Age. I don't know. But that's actually quite literally what they've gone back to. And I think for the average person, though, that's maybe like a MAGA soccer mom, you find yourself in a position of deep confusion. And that's why I think, you know, the ostensible rightward culture shift right now is not stable. I think that can easily be channeled by someone else. I don't know who it's going to be. But there were all kinds of videos out of New York City after Mamdani won the primary of people saying, no, I'm not a socialist, but I voted for him because this other option is terrible. And the previous order wouldn't have, you wouldn't have seen people voting for a socialist over the establishment because they hated the establishment so much. They would have been voting for the establishment over the socialist because they were so distrustful of socialism. But now, because the foundation is being questioned, people are going to be more sympathetic to the populists and the socialists than they are to the establishment. And again, that's what the Dems were, I think, late to realize. But that's where I think a lot of people are, is they're just fundamentally confused and they're looking for answers. And a lot of people aren't finding them in re-exploring, Bronze Age. A lot of people are, but they still remain kind of on the fringes. But your average, like, elder millennial mother is really confused, I think.
Yeah. How much do you think of this modernity questioning gets resolved in, like, the early 1970s? Like, rising cultural progressivism, decent economic growth, previous to neoliberal economics, like, I don't understand. I feel like that's when the questioning starts to spike, when things start getting worse, when wages and productivity become divergent, when most people are downwardly mobile rather than rising from, like, you know, their parents' generation proportionately. How much of those, like, deep modernity questionings actually gets resolved if you just wipe out the Chicago school economists?
The center could not hold. See, this is where I always find myself at, like, an impasse ultimately with my friends from, like, the democratic socialist left, is that for me, it's the culture that unravels before the economics. And for me, I look at what creates the marketplace incentives. And I think it was a culture that was coarsening, not because of the economics, but because of modernity, to be honest, because we were suddenly globalized. Like, some of this starts when people see the Vietnam War on television. I mean, literally see the Vietnam War on television in a way that you couldn't. I mean, the death blow to the soul of the West and the Kennedy assassination, like the myth of that, I don't think is entirely insane, because people saw this play out live on televisions. And I think there's something about that. Of course, there's the economics of televisions being invented and all of that. But to a certain extent, there wasn't, like, a market incentive to develop an atom bomb. There was, in fact, there definitely wasn't a market incentive to develop an atom bomb. It was a government project. And a lot of DARPA, a lot of these big inventions were DARPA government projects, and were not based on the market. They were based on humanity, sort of in the Shelley sense, lurching towards the Frankenstein. It can be done, so it must be done. It doesn't matter if we're getting paid for it. It's just the human condition is to continue building and building. And that's where I think you see in the 60s, it start to hit a boiling point culturally. And that's why I actually think you then start to see 70s, 80s, Milton Friedman talking the way that Milton Friedman talked about capitalism and markets, which was sort of nakedly incompassionate, but in a way that was libertarians forever, and still do, talk about it. And I understand this because I really believe it, as compassionate. The most compassionate thing to do is to, gut the New Deal, is to gut state capacity. And the most compassionate thing to do is let Wall Street and private equity grow into a behemoth, because it will ultimately be better for everyone. And this is where that experiment with free trade, for example, has been played out. The deindustrialization experiment has been played out. The private equity experiment has been played out. We're looking back on it and saying that was obviously wrong. Obviously wrong. And so that's where I think the 70s and the 80s, you started to see the permission slip be given to CEOs, corporations, Wall Street, the elite class to start exploiting and abusing people because the culture created an ideology that said it would be okay. And that's really dark.
We have our own version of this on the left. We just call it the Protestant work ethic, the role of ideology in culture. On these topics of liberty and platforms and so on, how do you feel about sports gambling?
Super black pilled on sports gambling. I don't know what the regulatory threshold should be for gambling exactly, but I do know that the lack of friction and the casino-ification of the smartphone, which is with you everywhere you go, is obviously wreaking social harm at a level that I think elites have not yet. It hasn't quite reared its head in their circles because they are not typically surrounded by people who are as susceptible to gambling to get ahead on bills, for example. Like you toss down, your last $20 in the hopes that it's going to make it be that bill that you can pay, right. Or that maybe you're behind on your phone bill, and if you you can be more easily convinced to gamble away your last $20 in a case like that. So I think it's partially something elites haven't been paying attention to, but that is wreaking havoc.
You're not going to make the bill anyway, but this way you might.
Yeah, you might.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. There's a nihilism to it.
Rational gambling. Yeah.
And it's just like, I'm supportive of the bill that Josh Hawley and Bernie Sanders have of capping usury in the credit card world. So
love it.
Again, I don't know what the threshold is. Their threshold, I think, would cap it at 20%, which is still, I think that's still extremely high. But I think it's a totally unjust,
we're capping it at
20%. Yeah. But I think it's right. It's a totally, from a moral standpoint, it is ill-gotten gains. It is a disgusting way to make money, because we know where the money is mostly coming from, and it's like 50% people with actual addictions are the profits here.
Oh yeah.
Huge. We know it. But what is the moral government threshold? I still don't have the perfect answer to that, except that it can't be what it is right now.
I sometimes wonder about this, if you go back to, sorry to bring up so many historical references for this episode, but if you go back to Adam Smith, his idea of free market, as he wrote it back in The Wealth of Nations, was that you would have an economy without rent. You would not have a rentier class because those rent payments were a drain on the productive capacity of society. And now we have rent extraction, usury, all of these things everywhere in the economy. And we wonder why we're growing at less than half the rate of China. It's because we have this enormous expansion of the rentier class. How many of these problems just get solved if we wipe out that sector of the economy?
It's crazy what the overlap was between sort of neoliberal Smith acolytes and the gig economy salesmen. And that's crazy to think about how we just all swallowed, not literally everyone, but as a culture, just swallowed the promises of the gig economy as it was coming up. And again, this is where people in elite circles don't understand how many people are leasing their cars, don't understand how many people, they actually do not understand how many people are renting. They don't understand renting their houses. They don't understand how many people are buying clothes and then returning them after they wear them. They don't understand that.
And also, once the platform exists, if you have the spare room, the effect on price for everyone who had a spare room, rents go up and now you're forced to rent it. That's what the platforms did, is they kind of allowed the market mechanisms, competition, to seep into every aspect of life. And now anything you had before that was unpriced is an asset you have to rent out.
Right.
We opened this podcast talking about the rightward shift of young men, and we've covered a few topics that they are particularly susceptible to, let's say sports gambling. I think it's a order of magnitude increase in their bankruptcies and 30% spike in suicide rates in some of these demographics. It's like a really big impact to men specifically through these platforms. What should we do about porn? What is the proper regulatory threshold for something like that?
The retina scanner, of course.
The retina scanner.
No, but this is a good example of something that is like why I feel like we're trapped in this paradigm that is intentional at this point.
It's very uncomfortable to talk about limiting people's liberty and what they can consume, but there's clearly a negative social effect that's correlated with this use.
And what is the most tempting solution to it? Biometrics. You feel like you're trapped between creating or allowing this to proliferate or allowing biometrics, because how else do you regulate it unless you make someone, right now the low-tech solution is uploading a driver's license or something like that. But that's obviously a stepping stone on the way to biometrics, which I think is, increasingly what we're heading towards, and that will never be free of the state and the institution. We talked about this earlier. I don't think it will be. But I think for me, this is again why the Trump era is just difficult for me and many other people. But also just modernity is difficult for me and many other people. I look at that and say, it should be so shameful to be the proprietor of a business like this. You should not be able to sleep at night. You shouldn't be allowed in polite society, and you shouldn't be able to sleep at night as a human being. You should be so deeply tortured by this. If you are somebody who owns one of these websites, operates one of these websites, or is like heavily invested in these websites, and that stigma, to me, what's much more powerful than any government solution is the return of that stigma. And my friends on the right would say you never get back to a place where there's stigma unless you use government tools, unless you use regulatory tools and state capacity. But if the direction is correct, but the process is unjust, this is where I'm still just like a classical liberal at heart. I just get really uncomfortable with that sometimes. Not all of the time. I think there should be much more enforcement of some existing laws that we already have that probably could be applied to pornography, for example. But we also just have never developed the legal framework for like telephones, for example. So like, how are we supposed to come up with, we have what's called common carrier, and Clarence Thomas flirted with the idea that maybe it's what you need to use to regulate social media. I think that was a decision in 2021. He wrote that in an opinion in 2021. And does anyone think like the common carrier regulation is perfect for, like, do we think our railroads are perfectly regulated at this point? I still think we're grappling with things that cross state lines, in the sense that we were talking earlier about things that cross global lines. Yeah. I don't think we've come up with like the perfect regulatory solutions for things that cross state lines, like let alone like national lines. So I don't know if it's a question where it's like, well, we can't do classical liberalism anymore, so you might as well just start really heavily regulating morality, or if it's, just trying to create a better culture and then hope that the cultural repair stops the leaks, if that makes sense.
What do you think about like turning it off for a few hours every day?
Because
I think we're all uncomfortable saying like what acts are permissible and what are not, and that kind of really nitty-gritty in the weeds kind of regulatory discussion. What if you just like turn it off between like, I don't know, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. or something?
Like China with TikTok for doing whatever it is.
And you allow people to do, whatever their liberty and desires are to be expressed and consume whatever material they want, but you just shut it off for a few hours every day.
We don't even think about things like that. Yeah, I think it's...
it's very anti-American.
It's very anti-American.
We don't even like our sodas to be regulated.
I know. But that's, and again, the Republican Party where Sarah Palin was holding up her big gulp. I think it was Sarah Palin. Like, out of my cold dead hands. Yeah. Became the MAHA party, right? And this is because the foundations were getting questioned. Yeah. And so as the foundations get questioned, I think people will be more responsive to ideas like that. But I think if you're doing something like that, you're conceding that this is fair regulatory ground. And if you're conceding it's fair regulatory ground, my answer would be like, well, you could probably just ban it at that point if it's something. So for me, it's more like I'm less even concerned about porn as I am that is anything on infinite scroll. Like it solve the problem of infinite scroll. And then maybe the porn problem gets significantly better, and the gambling problem gets infinitely better. It's just not, infinite scroll is a proxy for a lot of the things that have been casino-fied.
These apps take the kind of dopamine intervals from literal slot machines for their scrolling, whatever. Yeah.
And that's stuff that, as I started thinking about that, I started thinking literally about Doritos, right? Because it makes you question what ability the makers should have to attempt to physically addict you. I mean, I think Lunchables were invented after Philip Morris got, I think it's Kraft, right? Whatever the company is. Philip Morris moved from like cigarettes to food.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So what is the proper classically liberal regulatory framework? And is there one? And again, this is why for me, this moment is so difficult to be like, one side or the other, because I think some of these questions that are foundational are open. And I don't think any of us has the right solution, but I think there has to be some type of legal construct for smartphone apps, and the way that, like, there has to be something that we think about, whether it's thinking about these things like we think about Red Dye 40. What is it? We don't have it yet.
Well, at some point in the future, we'll have you back and we'll debate these things in the weeds. But if we don't propose something soon, I think it's going to be done as everything else seems to be, just in the worst way possible.
Yes.
The last question I want to ask you is, what country would you like the United States to resemble most? What is your ideal utopian vision that actually exists today?
I'm sure that people have answered that question by telling you Hungary or something. I would say the United States of America circa like 1999.
Okay.
I go back and forth on this question as to whether sort of Western civilization peaked in 1999 or maybe 2001, like August 2001. Was that when classical liberalism was most...
That's right before 9/11.
Yeah.
Okay.
Was most beautifully realized in a way where we hadn't, the scale hadn't tipped. And is there a way that we can get back that version? Like tech hadn't quite tipped into, you still had to use a landline and dial up. So is there a way that you can have...
Yeah.
It's not that everyone was perfect in 1999, but there was, I think, more upward mobility. There was more cultural optimism. Now, happiness had already started declining by that point. But to me, I genuinely wonder if we could have kept realizing a better version of America at that point, or if after 9/11, maybe after 2015, I don't know the exact date, the scale just tipped in the other direction in a way that I don't know that we can get it back. Maybe we can, but it tipped from tolerable. This life is never going to be amazing. Life is always like the best version of life is tolerable. And if we had sort of maximized tolerability in like 1999 or 2001 in a way that we've minimalized it now.
It's kind of a big cultural current, because I think in the hyper-future matrix simulacra, like whatever, when they put people into the matrix, they're simulating, I think, 1999 in perpetuity forever, right? Because it just got worse, and then the machines rose after that. That's how I remember it.
Yeah, that sounds right to me, actually.
Well, Emily, this was super fun. Thank you for joining us, and this has been a blast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. To watch part 2 of this episode, you can support the show on Patreon.